So the question that animates me in this anyway, and I think a lot of the people who are involved in it, is the question of what role upheavals, uprisings, revolts, and maybe even more violence, as in physical violence, overt, outright physical violence, plays in making of an urban landscape and in shaping the social geography of a city. And this is something that I've been interested in all of my career. When I was a graduate student, first at Penn State and then at Rutgers University, I was mostly studying homelessness and migratory labor in California, but when you are studying those kinds of things, you inevitably rub up against questions of violence and conflict and so forth. I was also involved as a student at Rutgers University in a couple of very small protests. We were protesting rising tuition, and we were stopped by the police, all 3 or 4 of us, because we were protesting in the wrong place. And so we were told to go protest over there, which was behind another building in a parking lot, nowhere near where the Board of Regents were. And so I got very interested in this, and so I did a seminar paper for a class I was in on protest and conflict over protest as a kind of land use conflict, a form of land use conflict. But my professor, Bob Lake, at the time said, that's, look into this kind of stuff, but you can't just base this on the one experience of you and your 3 or 4 comrades at Rutgers here. And so I ended up focusing on the free speech movement in Berkeley in 1964 and the People's Park riots of 1969. And so these moments of very, very intense conflict that are around concerned specifically with public space and with who can be in it, what you can do in it, how it's policed, what the role of the police is in it, all those sorts of things. And while I was doing the research for my dissertation, which was on migratory farm workers in California in the first part of the 20th century, I was doing most of the work in the Bancroft Library, in the archives of the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley, and this was in 1991. And it was right before another riot erupted around People's Park, as the city and the university were seeking to reclaim it from the user-built park that had been there. It led to 2 or 3 nights of rioting, and so I studied that as well. I've been trying to figure out this relationship between riots like that and violence and so forth ever since. And so it's been there as a part of my work all along. And mostly that work, though, has been focused on what it means for particular spaces or particular kinds of spaces. How do we understand public space as such in relationship to law, violence, conflict, police control, those sorts of questions. But what's driving all of this is this question of how we understand the relationship between violence and the making of urban spaces, the making of social and the material landscapes that people live in cities. And that requires, of course, thinking about violence in particular ways. And I think the starting point that we have, although we don't really develop any of this theoretically in here, is we want this to be as much a narrative about what happened and allow people to see out of that some of these processes. But the way we're thinking about it theoretically is in the kind of standard way that comes out of Walter Benjamin and a lot of other people, about the ways in which violence is, on the one hand, law-giving, right? It's that violent moment that leads to the creation of the laws and the social structures that govern social, political, economic, cultural life, right? So violence is law-giving. It's the resolution or the result of those violence, if not always the resolution, the result of those of that violence that leads to laws coming into place, which they can be laws in the formal sense, or we can think of economic laws, the sorts of social laws that govern places, the norms and those sorts of things. So on the one hand, violence is as law-giving, and on the other hand, violence is law-preserving. Right? The role of the police, for example, right, or other agents of violence. The number of times the military has been called out in New York City, I'm learning, is stunning. Right? During the 19th century, just about every time 3 people gathered on the street, the National Guard would be called in, it seemed, either at the behest of one political faction or at the behest of the other political faction, right? Because the police were actually tools of political factions a lot of the time. And so there's that sense of law as well. But there's also, of violence, excuse me, but there's also the question of the degree to which violence is, the degree to which some sort of practice is understood as violent or is scripted as violent when it might not be, right? Or we might, in retrospect, not think of it as violent at all. So, for example, Raymond Williams, just in his short piece in Keywords about violence, makes a very nice argument about the ways in which mere unruliness, right, can often be seen by authorities as violence, right? And so there's that move, that unruliness. And this actually gets built into law as well. The Supreme Court declared in 1921 in a case called Tri-Cities Labor Council versus American Steel, if I'm remembering correctly, declared that picketing is of necessity violent, right? And therefore must be regulated, right? This is just picketing. This is just marching up and down the street with a sign, right? It's of necessity violent. It's a violent act because it is an attempt to violently stop, that is to physically stop, right? Even if it's through a certain amount of moral persuasion, but to physically stop people from crossing a line, right? So the Supreme Court declared picketing to be violence, and therefore very regular. It can be regulated. So this becomes important in a number of labor actions in New York City in the 19-teens, 1920s, and may, in fact, because there's the Supreme Court case is 1921, if I'm remembering correctly, but there are lower court cases that mattered before then. And so during a period of real labor radicalism in the United States and in New York, the 19-teens, a lot of picketing, right, this, what we now think of a relatively benign form of labor protest, was simply outlawed. And as such, then, people looked for other means to express themselves, which were often more physically violent. Shutting down places, sit-ins, bombings, all those sorts of things. Which then, of course, lead to the reformulation of law, the remaking of spaces, and so forth. So what we're trying to do in this is, through the telling of the stories of all of these uprisings and riots and so forth, from really the 1640s and 1650s to the present, is the way that kind of the history, the social history and the social geography of New York City has unfolded. And the approach is very much on a focus on the events themselves. And one of my goals in thinking through this has been to try and allow some of the theories of unrest, of violence, of collective action, of all of those sorts of things, to arise out of that telling rather than to theorize it up front. I'm getting a bit of resistance from the students in my classes at the moment about this. In part because I'm misjudging at times what I take to be general knowledge and what is stuff that I've figured out over years and years and years of thinking about this. But we'll see how that particular struggle gets worked out. So we've worked all the way through this. As I said, I'm actually now up to 1969, 1970, these things. And one of the things that becomes really apparent in thinking about violence in New York City, thinking about uprisings, thinking about riot and revolt and so forth, is just how constant it is. It's absolutely stunning when you start looking at the historical record, just how constant unrest is in that city. We often think of unrest as being these moments of unrest, right? These moments that punctuate a time of labor peace, or a time of peace. I'm mixing up my projects at times. What I think a better way to think about it is that those moments of peace, of settlement, are these extraordinary moments, or extraordinary islands in an incredibly wide sea of upheaval, right? Really tempestuous seas, where there are occasional calm moments, right? Where, for whatever reasons, however hegemonic power is being exercised, however organizing is working, something like that, there isn't direct head-to-head confrontation. But it's stunning just how rare it is. I don't have all the dates looking in this, but even if you just think about the second half of the 18th century, which is a revolutionary period, of course, right? But if you just think about that time, it's almost constant, right? If there's the Great Negro Uprising of 1741, which is perhaps, there's a lot of controversy about what really happened and why, but perhaps a time when slaves in New York City rose up against their masters, burnt houses, threatened to mutilate and kill many. It seems to have been a conspiracy that was hatched in a tavern on the Hudson River, Houston's Tavern. Houston himself was an Irish immigrant, but among him, his wife, their servant girl, their daughter, Peggy Carey, the Irish Newfoundland beauty, as she was always called, and a large number of slaves, people like Caesar or Quack, various others who would meet there, which the historians Marcus Rediker and Leinbach, I'm forgetting his first name, called the Motley Crew, right? That are always meeting there, and they hatch a plot, it seems, to basically destroy Manhattan. Houston's is about where the World Trade Center site is now, right? It's on the northern edges of the city at the time, and the reaction to that by the governing authorities was swift and it was severe, and it led to the hanging, burning at the stake, or deportation of over 100 slaves, the execution of 4 white people, Houston, his wife, Peggy Carey, and one other, and it was an incredibly violent response to this, right? It also shifted how the slave trade worked. It did all those sorts of things. So this is 1741, right? There's a series of riots in the 1750s. It's part of a tradition of popular uprisings, of overturnings, particularly on feast days, those sorts of things. The big plot party at Houston was a Christmas feast, in fact, where the whites were serving the blacks. Everything was overturned in a very medieval kind of form of popular protest. And that continues through the Stamp Act riots of 1765 and into the Revolutionary period. And in fact, into the 1770s, 1780s, and 1790s, with which, according to the historian Paul Gillier, if we think about the period from really about 1780 to 1801, we should think of it as a time when New York City was ruled by what he calls mobocracy, right? And it's different factions seeking to control the mobs and their riots at different times, right? So it's a constant presence then. And it's nearly as constant in the 19th century as well. Sometimes these are very class-based struggles, and clearly, often they are race-based struggles. Sometimes they're both, of course. And so all the way through that period, you see much of the same thing. And it's really these extraordinary moments when there's not much, these moments when there's not much happening that are extraordinary. 1946 to about 1964, for example. It's about the longest period I've found where there's just not a lot of rioting, right? There's just not a great deal. There's a fair amount of labor agitation that's going on, but as part of the great compromise of the area and so forth, a lot of that is heavily controlled. There are fist fights on the waterfront, of course, and all that about control over how labor is going to operate and so forth, but there isn't the sort of uprisings that you see. That's about it, right? That, what is that, 18-year period? About the longest stretch where there isn't some sort of an uprising like this. So what does this kind of say about the way the landscape gets made and remade, the way that social geographies shift and so forth? At one level, it's really hard to say. There are times when you can see, this massive uprising of some sort, or a riot. It's pretty intense. It's really heavily covered in the papers and so forth. And then you don't see any clear evidence, at least in the landscape, of what might have changed, if anything. You can see some social things that might have changed. Some reform in the police, perhaps, right? That sort of stuff, but not much else. But typically, you can see certain things. So following the Tenderloin Riot of 1901, right, at a time where the social geography of the city actually shifts quite drastically. The Tenderloin Riot began when, on a hot summer night, as many do, in August 1901, when a young African-American woman went to a corner in the Tenderloin, which is basically to the west of where Penn Station is now. And she went to a street corner to try and convince her relatively new husband that he ought to come home from the saloon that he was hanging out in. And he convinced her that he would after just another drink or something like that. And it was very much a men's bar that he was in, mixed race largely. So she was standing outside on the corner. This is basically the red light district of New York City at the time. And she gets accosted by a white man. He grabs her. And so he grabs her and is holding her. He turns out to be an undercover cop. And he is convinced that she is a prostitute. A black woman standing on a corner at midnight or a little bit after. And so he's holding her. Someone else on the street comes to intervene. And about then, her husband comes out of the bar, sees this guy, pulls a knife, and stabs the cop, right, who's manhandling his wife. And the cop ends up dying a day later. And so the guy who stabs him takes off, quickly gets across the Hudson, eventually goes down to Washington, D.C., where his mother is. A little while later, his wife follows him. But in the meantime, this stabbing leads to a white riot, and very much a police riot, where for 2 nights, African Americans are targeted all through the Tenderloin and to some degree in some other parts of the city. And the Tenderloin was the place for African Americans at the time because of all the restrictive reasons that we know, the way that segregation works and so forth. And so so there's very, very intense rioting, and it's very much a police riot. It's an Irish police force for the most part, and they end up and it lasts for a couple of nights. It's put out pretty much by a thunderstorm, as a number of riots are in New York City and lots of other places. And just as something of an aside there, I was doing research in Manchester, England in 2011 and left there 1 week before the British riots of that year hit. And I was kind of bummed because the apartment/hotel that I was staying in would have had the most perfect view of all of them. But we've been interviewing cops here about community policing, about community cohesion. And right after this happens, I write to one of them and to say, well, what do you have to say about community cohesion now? And he has some very smart things to say. And then he also says the only thing that saved Manchester was what he calls PC rain, right? It started raining really hard, as it does in Manchester, and that kind of quelled the rioting. And that's happened in New York a number of times too. But the upshot of the Tenderloin Riot was connected with a number of other things, was the opening up of Harlem to African Americans. There had always been blacks in Harlem, right, from the time that it was a village and so forth, but as a place where a lot of blacks moved to, it really is a result, in large part, of this riot. Middle-class blacks in particular, the black bourgeoisie, looks to get out of the Tenderloin. There are all the associations that go on with that. It's the red light district and everything else. They're interested in a certain kind of bourgeois black respectability, start looking to get out. At the same time, of course, the U.S. enters yet another economic crisis, a bank scare, which means that a lot of developers in Harlem, who are building on spec in anticipation of the subway opening in 1904, are losing their shirts. And so they start selling to African Americans when they wouldn't have before. At the same time that this riot is, in essence, pushing black people out of the Tenderloin. And so there's a case where you can see it's a convergence of forces, but you can see a particular moment of struggle, of violence, leading to a transformation of the social geography, and then of course the cultural history of the city as well. And of course to pin that all on the Tenderloin Riot would be a gross oversimplification, which is one reason why we're well over our word limits now already. So, but we found any number of those kinds of things where you can point to these sorts of events and the effects that they've had in reshaping some of the city. Or to take just one other example. One other example along those lines, that moment from 1910 to 1920, roughly, of kind of real labor radicalism in the United States, a rise of certain kind of anarchism, of syndicalism, and after 1917, an official communism, and so forth, right? All those things, which are being struggled over all around the United States. The struggles are particularly intense in New York City. And as in a lot of places, they lead to struggles between different factions, of course, between it leads to a lot of organizing, but it also leads to bombing and bombings. And in 1920, it's what Mike Davis calls the first car bomb. It was actually in a horse-drawn carriage, but this anarchist by the name of Buddha, B-U-D-A, drives a horse cart into Wall Street and across from the J.P. Morgan. I'm pretty sure it's J.P. Morgan. I'm forgetting without my notes all right in front of me as to which one it was. And gets out of there right before it explodes. He got himself back to Italy and really wasn't exposed the person who did this until well after the fact. But this bombing, right, this explosion in Wall Street, which is linked with the prosecution of Sacco and Vanzetti. It's linked with this uprising. It's connected to struggles between communists and anarchists at the time. All those sorts of things. And it's part of a long 10-year history of increasing militancy within New York City. Leads to a real transformation of the built environment in Wall Street. A hardening of buildings. I mean, we're familiar with this story now, right? But there's a past history to what we kind of take for granted now, that if there's a terrorist attack, there's going to be a change in the landscape, right? So in 1920, you can start seeing this. And so a change in the way, in traffic patterns, the building of new plazas to keep people and crowds out of the city center itself, out of the financial center itself. All these sorts of things begin to come out of this moment of anarchism and the terrorist bombing that was part of it. So you can start seeing those kinds of shifts too, and one of the things you can do with that then is push back the timeline and how we think about the role of terrorism in shaping city space. And that's a history that's been there a long time. In fact, you can push it back to the 1712 slave uprising if you wanted, right? Because the white residents of New Amsterdam then certainly saw these as terrorist attacks, even if the language wasn't quite there yet to talk about them in those terms. And so you can draw a line in the city or in the history of the city through events like that. And then the other thing that you can do with this is you can draw a line between different kinds of uprisings, right? One's related to labor, for example, one's directly connected to questions of race, but also across political factions and political struggles. From the ways in which either Democrats or Republicans in Civil War era New York would mobilize mobs and crowds, right? To the ways in which various conservative factions, including a good deal of Wall Street involvement, were able to mobilize mobs of construction workers in 1970, in May of 1970, to beat up anti-war protesters, right? And what have come to be known as the Hard Hat Riots. And so you can link across all of these things, and we're trying to find ways to do some of this. And then what we hope will result out of all of this in this Revolting New York project, then is when people pick this up, they can start seeing the continuity of struggle and change, of violence and reaction, of the fight against authority, right, and the reassertion of authority in both the built landscape and in kind of the social history of the city.